I'm just going to sit here with you for a good long while and tell you about something that's been on my mind lately. Something warm and gentle that I hope will help you relax, help you let go of the day, help you drift off into peaceful sleep. I've been thinking about the farm, my grandparents' farm where I spent so many days when I was young. Oh, what a place that was. Not fancy, mind you. Not one of those big operations you see nowadays. Just a simple family farm. The kind where everything had its place and its purpose, where the days moved slow and steady like the seasons themselves. The farmhouse sat at the end of a long dirt road, lined on both sides with oak trees that must have been 100 years old even then. In summer, those trees made a canopy over the road, a tunnel of green shade that kept you cool even on the hottest days. And in autumn, those oaks would turn the most beautiful colors. Gold and amber and russet, every shade of fall you could imagine. The leaves would drift down covering the road, and when you walked through them, they'd make this soft rustling sound like they were whispering secrets to each other. I can see that farmhouse now, clear as day, even though it's been so many years. White clapboard siding, a little weathered but solid and strong. A wide front porch that wrapped around two sides with a swing hanging from chains that creaked just a bit when you rocked. My grandmother had pots of geraniums on that porch, as bright red ones that she tended every day, pinching off the dead blooms, making sure they had enough water. The screen door had this particular sound when it closed, a creak, then a slap, then a gentle bounce. I can hear it still. That sound meant you were home, meant you were safe, meant there will be something good waiting inside. Usually something my grandmother had been baking, filling the house with smells that made your mouth water and your heart feel full. Let me tell you about my grandmother first, because she was the heart of that place, really. Small woman, not much over 5 feet tall, but she had this presence about her, this calm, steady way of being that made everything seem all right, no matter what was happening. She wore her hair in a bun, always neat, always just so. And she had these aprons, or different ones for different tasks. A nice one for receiving company, a sturdy one for cooking, an old one for garden work. Each one told you what kind of day it was going to be. Her hands were always busy, always doing something. Kneading bread, snapping beans, mending clothes, stroking the cat that lived in the barn but somehow always ended up in the kitchen. But they were gentle hands, soft despite all the work they did. When she'd brush my hair back from my forehead, or pat my cheek, or take my hand to lead me somewhere, those hands felt like love itself, if love could be a physical thing. She hummed while she worked, not songs you could name necessarily, just melodies that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. Old tunes passed down through generations, wordless but full of meaning. Sometimes I'd wake up in the morning and hear her humming downstairs in the kitchen, and I'd lie there in bed for a minute, just listening, feeling safe and content, knowing the day was beginning the way it should. My grandfather was a different sort, tall and lean, all sinew and sun-weathered skin. He didn't talk much, not like some folks who feel the need to fill every silence with words. But when he did speak, you listened, because what he said mattered. He had this deep, quiet voice that seemed to come from somewhere down in his chest, rough but not harsh, like gravel that's been worn smooth by a river. His hands were huge, with calluses and old scars from a lifetime of farm work. Hands that could handle the most delicate newborn chick with incredible gentleness, or lift 100-pound feed sack like it was nothing. He'd let me examine those hands sometimes, tracing the lines and scars, and he'd tell me stories about where each mark came from. A cut from barbed wire here, a burn from a tractor engine there. Each one a memory, a lesson, a moment in a long life of work. He wore the same thing every day, near about. Overalls, usually blue but faded from washing and sun. A flannel shirt underneath, long-sleeved even in summer because it protected his arms from sun and scratches. Work boots that had been resoled more times than I could count because you didn't just throw things away when they wore out. You fixed them. You made them last. And a hat. Always a hat. Straw in summer, felt in winter, both shaped by years of wear into something uniquely his. The farm itself was maybe 100 acres, give or take. Not all of it was worked, you understand. There was the house and the yard, with my grandmother's flower gardens and vegetable patch. There was the barn, big and red and smelling of hay and animals and old wood. There were the fields where my grandfather grew corn and soybeans, hay for the animals, sometimes wheat. And then there was pasture for the cattle, woods in the back corners where I wasn't supposed to go alone, but sometimes did anyway. A creek that ran through the property, clear and cold and full of possibility. Let me walk you through a day there, a typical summer day, the kind I lived over and over and never got tired of. Let your mind walk with me, slow and easy, and maybe as we walk through this memory together, you'll feel some of that peace I felt, some of that deep, simple contentment. I'd wake up early, not because I had to, but because the farm woke up early and it would wake you too. Roosters crowing, though we only kept a few chickens. Cows lowing out in the pasture waiting to be milked. The sound of my grandfather's boots on the porch below my window, then the creak of the screen door as he headed out to start his morning chores. And the smell, oh, the smell of morning on that farm, fresh and clean and green, with dew heavy on everything, and usually a hint of whatever my grandmother was cooking for breakfast. My room was small, up under the eaves on the second floor. Just a simple iron bed with a quilt my grandmother had made, a dresser that had been there since my father was a boy, a rag rug on the wooden floor. The window looked out over the backyard and the garden, and if I knelt on the bed and pressed my face to the screen, I could see all the way to the pasture and the woods beyond. I'd get dressed slow, no rush, in the clothes my grandmother had laid out the night before, usually dungarees and a t-shirt, both worn soft from many washings, bare feet, because shoes could wait until after breakfast, and there was something wonderful about the feel of those old floorboards under your feet, cool and smooth. Down the stairs, one at a time, my hand on the banister that generations had worn smooth. The stairs creaked in places, and I knew which ones could play them almost like an instrument. The seventh one from the top always groaned. The third one from the bottom squeaked. Little details you learn when you spend enough time in a place, when you pay attention to things. The kitchen would be warm already despite the early hour. My grandmother at the stove, That's where she'd be, tending to whatever was cooking, and oh, the smells! Coffee, strong and dark, percolating on the stove, bacon sizzling in the cast iron skillet, the one that had been seasoned by decades of use, biscuits in the oven, rising and browning, and you could smell the butter and buttermilk in them. Sometimes pancakes instead, or oatmeal in the winter, but always something hot, something made from scratch, something made with care. "Good morning, sweetheart," she'd say, not turning from the stove, but knowing I was there anyway. "Did you sleep well?" And I'd say I did, even if I hadn't, because that was the right answer, the one that made her smile. I'd sit at the table, the old wooden one with mismatched chairs, and she'd pour me a glass of milk, fresh from our own cows, still cold from the ice box. That milk tasted different from what you get in stores now. Richer, creamier, more alive somehow. It tasted like it came from a real animal, not a factory. It tasted like it meant something. My grandfather would come in soon after, stomping his boots on the porch to knock off the dirt, even though there usually wasn't much. Just habit, just the way things were done. He'd wash his hands at the sink, using the rough soap that smelled of lye, scrubbing under his nails where the dirt liked to hide. Then he'd sit at the head of the table, and my grandmother would bring over the food, and we'd eat. We didn't talk much at breakfast, not out of unfriendliness, but because morning felt sacred somehow, quiet, like the day was still deciding what it wanted to be. We'd eat slowly, chewing thoroughly the way my grandmother insisted was good for digestion. The bacon crispy but not burnt. The biscuits fluffy inside with a golden crust, split open and filled with butter that melted into every crevice. Sometimes honey drizzled on top, thick and golden and tasting of wildflowers. Sometimes my grandmother's homemade jam, strawberry or blackberry, depending on the season. The coffee I wasn't allowed to have, not yet, not until I was older. But I didn't mind. I liked my milk, and sometimes my grandmother would let me have a tiny cup of what she called coffee, but was really mostly warm milk with just a splash of coffee in it, just enough to make me feel grown up. After breakfast, my grandfather would sit back and sigh. This satisfied sound that meant the meal was good, the day was starting right. He'd pull out his pipe, though he wouldn't light it in the house, just hold it, turn it over in his hands. This ritual he did while he thought about the work ahead. "Got to check the fence in the south pasture," he might say. "Spotted a weak post yesterday." Or, "Time to cut the hay in the back field, weather holding like it is." Or, "Should see how the corn's doing, see if it needs another watering." Always something, always the next task, but never said with stress or hurry. Just stated, simple facts, the ongoing work of keeping a farm running. And then he'd look at me, and his eyes would have this little twinkle. "Want to come along?" he'd ask, though he knew the answer, always knew the answer. Of course I wanted to come along. I always wanted to come along. But first, the dishes. My grandmother didn't believe in leaving a mess even for a minute. "A clean kitchen is a peaceful kitchen," she'd say. So I'd help her clear the table, carry plates to the sink while she filled it with hot water and soap. She'd wash, I'd dry, and we'd put everything away in its proper place. The plates in the cupboard, stacked just so. The silverware in the drawer, sorted by type. The skillet back on the stove, ready for the next meal. And while we worked, She'd talk to me, tell me about her day ahead, the bread she was going to bake, the garden that needed weeding, the mending that had piled up. Or she'd tell me stories from when she was young, when she first came to this farm as a bride, how different and scary it had seemed at first, how she'd grown to love it, how it had become home. "Your grandfather," she'd say, and her voice would get soft. He was so patient with me. I didn't know the first thing about farm life, me being a town girl, but he showed me, slow and gentle, never making me feel foolish for not knowing. That's how you teach someone, you know, with patience and kindness. Remember that. And I would. I'd store away these little pearls of wisdom she'd dropped so casually, not realizing they were lessons, just thinking we were talking. But she was teaching me all the time in everything she did, teaching me how to live, how to work, how to love. Then it was time to go out with my grandfather. I'd put on shoes finally, old sneakers that were fine for farm work, and we'd head out into the day, him with his long stride, me hurrying to keep up but never minding because I was going with him, and that was what mattered. The morning would still be cool, the dew still heavy on the grass. We'd walk through the yard, past my grandmother's flower beds, all neat and weeded and blooming with whatever was in season. Zinnias and marigolds, cosmos and snapdragons, hollyhocks tall as my shoulder. She had this gift for making things grow, for knowing just what each plant needed. Water and sun and a little bit of talking too, she'd say. Plants respond to a kind voice just like people do. Past the garden where rows of vegetables were growing, the tomatoes on their stakes, getting bigger by the day, starting to blush from green to red. The beans climbing their poles, the squash sprawling across the ground, their big leaves hiding treasures underneath. The corn already tall, rustling when the breeze blew through it, sounding like whispered conversations. To the barn, that big red structure that dominated the farmyard. The doors would already be open, letting in light and air. Inside it was dim and cool, a respite from the sun that was starting to climb higher, starting to bring real heat. The smell in there, oh, that barn smell, hay and straw and animals and leather and dust and time. Not unpleasant, not at all. Comforting in its way. Honest, real. The cows would be in their stanchions if they hadn't been let out to pasture yet. Big, gentle creatures with soft brown eyes and wet noses. They'd turn their heads to look at us, chewing their cud in that perpetual motion, calm and patient. My grandfather would run his hand along their flanks as he passed, greeting them, checking them, just being present with them in that quiet way he had. The barn cats would be around somewhere, half-wild things that tolerated humans, but didn't depend on them. They kept the mice down, and in return they got a warm place to sleep and sometimes a saucer of milk. They'd watch us from the rafters, golden eyes glowing in the dim light, or they'd weave between our legs, hoping for attention or a treat. There were tools everywhere in that barn, each one with its purpose, each one kept clean and sharp and ready. Pitchforks and shovels and rakes, saws and hammers and wrenches, buckets and ropes and chains, everything organized in a way that made sense if you knew the system, and my grandfather knew the system like he knew his own hands. He'd select what he needed for the day's work. If we were checking fence, that meant fence pliers and a come-along and maybe some new wire. If we were working in the field, that might mean tools for the tractor or implements to hitch up behind it. He moved through the barn with purpose, but without haste, gathering what he needed, and I'd try to help, carrying what I could, feeling useful and important. Then we'd head out, really out, into the farm proper. And here's where the day would slow down even more, would open up into something timeless and peaceful. Walking through the fields was like walking through a different world. The corn, when it was high, made corridors of green, paths you could walk through where the leaves brushed against you and the stalks stood like soldiers at attention. It was cooler in there, sheltered from the direct sun, and quiet, except for the rustling and the occasional bird. My grandfather would stop sometimes, pull an ear down, peel back the husk to check how it was developing. The kernels would still be small and pale, or if it was later in the season, swollen and bright yellow, tight in their rows. "Coming along nicely," he'd say, or "could use some rain," or "this'll be ready before we know it." Always observing, always assessing, but never worrying. Things would work out, or they wouldn't, and fretting didn't change anything. You did your best and trusted in the seasons and accepted what came. The soybeans were different. Lower to the ground, a sea of green leaves that rippled in the wind like water. They'd be flowering, maybe. Tiny white or purple blossoms that you had to look close to see. And later, pods would form, hanging heavy with beans, and eventually they'd turn brown and dry, and it would be time to harvest. But that was later. In the moment, we were just walking, just being in the field. And my grandfather was teaching me without seeming to teach, pointing out things, the different stages of growth, how you could tell if a plant was healthy or stressed, what signs to look for, how the weather affected things, how everything was connected, the soil and the rain and the sun and the seed and the hand of the farmer, all working together to create something. We'd reach the fence line, and he'd walk along it slowly, checking each post, each strand of wire, looking for breaks or sags or places where animals had pushed against it and weakened it. When he found something that needed fixing, he'd stop and fix it right there. No putting it off, no making a list to do later. If something needed doing and you could do it now, you did it now. That was his way. I'd watch him work, handing him tools when he needed them, or learning by watching. The way he'd tighten the wire just so, not too tight, or it would snap in the winter cold, not too loose, or the animals would push through it. The way he'd brace a weak post, or replace one that had rotted at the base. The way he'd splice wire where it had broken, making it as strong or stronger than it was before. And while he worked, sometimes he'd talk. Tell me about when he'd first built this fence, back when my father was just a boy. How hard the ground was in some places, rocky and stubborn. How he'd learned to read the land, to know where water would run, where frost would heave the posts come spring. How a good fence was like anything else worth doing. It took time and patience and attention to detail. But once it was done right, it would serve you well for years. Measure twice, cut once, he'd say. Take your time and do it right the first time, and you won't be doing it again next week. Simple wisdom, the kind that applies to far more than fence building, the kind I still carry with me all these years later. When the work was done, we'd sit for a bit, right there in the shade of a tree that grew along the fence line. An old oak, gnarled and spreading, that had probably been there since before the farm was a farm. We'd sit with our backs against that tree, and my grandfather would pull out his canteen, take a drink of water, pass it to me. The water was warm from sitting in the sun, but it tasted good, tasted honest, and we'd just sit there, not talking, just being, looking out over the field, watching the wind move through the crops, listening to the birds, the insects, the distant sound of the highway that was close enough to hear, but far enough not to matter, feeling the breeze, the sun through the leaves, the solid presence of the tree at our backs. These were the moments I treasure most, looking back. Not the dramatic things, not the special occasions, just these quiet times, sitting with my grandfather, both of us comfortable in silence, both of us exactly where we wanted to be. After a while, he'd stir, push himself to his feet with a little grunt. "Best get back," he'd say. "Your grandmother will have lunch ready soon, and she doesn't like to be kept waiting." The walk back would be leisurely, following the fence line to the corner, then cutting across the pasture where the cows grazed. They'd lift their heads to watch us pass, some of them coming over to investigate, snuffling with their wet noses, looking for treats. My grandfather would scratch their foreheads between their eyes where they seemed to like it, and they'd lean into his hand like big dogs. "Good girls," he'd murmur, "good old girls." He knew each one by sight, could tell you which was which, even though to me they all looked mostly the same. But he knew their personalities, knew which ones were gentle and which ones were ornery, which ones gave the most milk, which ones were likely to cause trouble. We'd pass the pond, a small one he'd dug years ago, fed by a spring and run off from the fields. It had cattails around the edges and frogs that would leap into the water with little splashes when we got close. Dragonflies hovered over the surface, their wings catching the light, iridescent blue and green. Sometimes we'd see a heron standing still as a statue in the shallows, waiting for a fish. But usually our approach would send it flapping away, big wings beating slow, neck tucked back, legs trailing behind, back past the garden where we could see my grandmother moving between the rows, her apron full of whatever she was harvesting. She'd look up and we'd wave back. My grandfather's face would soften when he looked at her just a little, just enough to notice if you were paying attention. 60 years they'd been married by then, or thereabouts, and he still looked at her like she was something precious. Into the house, where the table would already be set for lunch. Simple food again, but good. Sandwiches made with her homemade bread, thick slices of ham or turkey from birds they'd raised themselves, sliced tomatoes from the garden, still warm from the sun, sprinkled with salt and pepper, cucumbers in vinegar, potato salad or coleslaw, iced tea, sweet and cold, with mint from the patch by the porch. We'd eat in companionable silence, tired from the morning's work, but satisfied. My grandmother would ask about the fence, and my grandfather would tell her it was fixed, all taken care of. She'd nod, like she never doubted it would be, and then she'd tell us about her morning, the bread she'd baked, the beans she'd put up in jars, the letter she'd received from her sister in town. After lunch, there was usually a period of rest. The heat of the day, you see, the early afternoon when the sun was at its peak and the air shimmered with it. Not a good time for hard work. Even the animals knew it, seeking shade, standing still, waiting for the world to cool down a bit. My grandfather would settle into his chair in the living room, the one that fit him like a glove, worn to the shape of his body. He'd pick up the newspaper, even though it was yesterday's newspaper, because they only got delivery once a day and it came in the afternoon. He'd read for a bit, or pretend to read while he actually dozed, the paper slowly lowering until it rested on his chest, his breathing deep and even. My grandmother would sit in her chair, her hands never idle even at rest. She'd have some handwork always, mending or knitting or embroidery, something to keep her fingers busy. The click of her needles was a soothing sound, rhythmic and peaceful, marking time in a gentle way. And I would find a spot, maybe on the floor with a book, maybe on the couch, maybe just lying there looking at the ceiling and thinking about nothing in particular. The house would be quiet except for small sounds. The tick of the clock on the mantel, the creak of the house settling, a fly buzzing against the window screen, the distant crow of a rooster. Sometimes I'd drift off to sleep myself, there in the cool dimness of the living room, and I'd wake up an hour later, disoriented, not sure what day it was or how long I'd been sleeping. My grandmother would smile at me. "Have a good rest?" she'd ask, and I'd nod, still fuzzy with sleep. Late afternoon, as the heat began to break, the farm would come alive again. My grandfather would stir, fold his newspaper neatly, set it aside. There were evening chores to do, animals to feed and water, eggs to gather from the chickens. I loved gathering eggs. The hen house was a small building behind the barn, divided into nesting boxes where the hens would go to lay. It smelled of straw and chicken droppings and something else, something warm and alive. The hens would be there, some still sitting on their nests, others pecking around in the yard outside. They'd complain when you reached under them, a scolding cluck that said they didn't appreciate being disturbed, but they wouldn't peck, or usually wouldn't. There was one hen, a Rhode Island red we called Bertha, who was mean as could be and would go for your hand if you weren't careful. But the eggs, oh, the eggs were treasures, warm from the hen's body, smooth and perfect, some white, some brown, depending on the breed. I'd gather them carefully, placing them in the wire basket, trying not to break any. A broken egg was a small tragedy, all waste of good food, and my grandmother would look disappointed even if she didn't say anything. My grandfather would be feeding the pigs, great big animals that lived in a pen with a shelter and a mud wallow where they could cool off. They'd hear him coming and get excited, squealing and grunting, pressing against the fence. He'd dump their slop, kitchen scraps and grain mixed with water, into the trough, and they'd shove and push to get at it, eating with enthusiastic snorts and smacks. "Pigs are smart," my grandfather would tell me. "Smarter than dogs, some say, but they're pigs, and they act like pigs, and there's nothing wrong with that. Everything should be what it is, and not try to be something else. The cows would need to be brought in for evening milking if they were still out to pasture. That was a slow process, walking out to where they were grazing, calling to them. They'd lift their heads, consider whether they felt like coming in, then eventually they'd start moving toward the barn, a slow procession, stopping to grab one more mouthful of grass, then another, in no particular hurry. My grandfather would milk them by hand, sitting on a three-legged stool, his head pressed against the cow's warm flank. The milk would hiss into the pail in rhythmic streams, white and foamy. The barn cats would gather, knowing there might be a squirt of milk aimed their way, and they'd catch it in their mouths, pink tongues lapping. I'd watch, mesmerized by the rhythm of it, the skill of it. He made it look easy, but when I tried, my hands would get tired after just a few squeezes, and the milk would barely come at all. "Takes practice," he'd say. Strong hands and practice. You'll get there. When all the chores were done, when the animals were fed and settled for the night, when the milk was strained and put away in the cold cellar, when everything was tended and tucked in, then it would be time for supper. My grandmother would have been cooking while we were doing chores. Something hearty and simple. Fried chicken, maybe. The kind that's been soaked in buttermilk and dredged in seasoned flour and fried until the skin is crispy and golden, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans cooked with bacon and onions, biscuits, always biscuits, and for dessert, pie, apple or cherry or peach. Depending on what was in season, the crust flaky and golden, the filling sweet and tart, all at once. We'd eat as the light faded outside, the kitchen windows open to let in the evening breeze. And after supper, after the dishes were washed and put away, we'd go out to the porch and sit. This was my favorite time of day, I think. The gloaming, that in-between time when day hasn't quite become night, when the world is soft and gentle and quiet. The heat would be gone, replaced by cool air that smelled of earth and growing things. The sky would turn colors, orange and pink and purple, and finally deepen in blue. Stars would start to appear, first one, then a few, then more and more until the sky was full of them. My grandfather would sit in his rocking chair, smoking his pipe now, the tobacco smoke sweet and aromatic in the evening air. My grandmother would sit in her chair, maybe shelling peas or just resting, her day's work done, and I'd sit on the porch steps, watching lightning bugs start to appear in the yard, little floating sparks of light that would glow and fade, glow and fade. Sometimes my grandfather would talk, telling stories about the old days, about when he was young, about the farm as it used to be. Sometimes my grandmother would sing old hymns or folk songs, her voice soft and a little wavering but sweet. Sometimes we'd just sit in silence, rocking or swaying or sitting still, listening to the sounds of evening. Crickets chirping, a symphony of them all tuning up together, the occasional hoot of an owl from the woods, a dog barking somewhere far off, the creak of the porch swing's chains, the gentle sound of the rocking chairs on the wooden porch floor, peaceful sounds, safe sounds, the sounds of home. Eventually, the darkness would be complete, the stars bright and close feeling in the clear country air. "Well," my grandfather would say, knocking his pipe against the porch rail to empty it, "I suppose it's time to turn in." And we'd go inside, my grandmother checking that everything was locked, that the stove was off, that all was secure. We'd climb the stairs, me to my little room under the eaves, them to their room at the front of the house. I'd change into my pajamas, brush my teeth at the sink in the hall bathroom using the toothpaste that came in a tin and tasted of mint and childhood. I'd climb into bed, the sheets cool and clean, smelling of sunshine and fresh air from hanging on the line. My grandmother would come in to say good night, tucking the quilt up around me, smoothing my hair back from my forehead, kissing me gently. "Sleep well, sweetheart," she'd say. "Tomorrow's another day." And I would sleep well, so well. There, in that little room, with the sounds of the farm settling around me and the cool night air coming through the window and the knowledge that I was safe and loved and exactly where I was supposed to be. Those summer days on the farm, they stretched out like forever when I was living them. Each one seemed to last a week, packed full of moments and experiences and small wonders. Time moved differently there, slower and richer, like honey dripping from a spoon. I remember one particular day, must have been mid-July, when the heat was at its peak and the whole world seemed to be drowsing in the sun. My grandfather decided it was too hot for field work, that we'd do something different. "Let's go fishing," he said after breakfast, and my grandmother smiled and packed us a lunch. The creek ran through the back of the property, a good half-mile walk from the house. We followed a path that was barely a path, just a track worn through the grass by generations of feet, both human and animal. My grandfather walked ahead, carrying the fishing poles, simple cane poles with line and hooks and bobbers. I carried the lunch basket and the can of worms we'd dug that morning from the cool earth behind the barn. The walk took us through different parts of the farm, past the cornfield, where the stalks were head high now and rustling in the slight breeze, through a patch of wildflowers, Queen Anne's lace and black-eyed Susans and purple clover that hummed with bees, along the edge of the pasture where the cows watched us with lazy interest, tails swishing at flies, and then into the woods, and oh, what a relief that was. The temperature dropped 10 degrees as soon as we stepped under the canopy. The trees here were old, a mix of oak and hickory and maple, with underbrush of dogwood and redbud. The ground was carpeted with last year's leaves, soft and silent under our feet. My grandfather moved through the woods like he was part of them, ducking under branches, stepping over roots, reading the land without seeming to think about it. I followed in his footsteps, literally, trying to step where he stepped, move like he moved. We could hear the creek before we could see it, a bubbling, chattering sound that grew louder as we got closer. And then there it was, breaking through the trees into the open, flowing over rocks and around bends, creating little pools and rapids, shallow in some places, deeper in others. My grandfather had a favorite spot. A place where the creek widened into a pool maybe 15 feet across and deep enough that you couldn't see the bottom. A big sycamore tree grew on the bank, its roots exposed and twisted, creating perfect seats. The water here was dark and mysterious, flowing in from above, flowing out below, and in between, circling and swirling in lazy patterns. We settled ourselves on those sycamore roots, getting comfortable. My grandfather baited our hooks with the worms, which wriggled and protested, but gave up eventually. He showed me how to cast, a gentle swing and release, letting the line arc out over the water, the bobber landing with a soft plop, the hook sinking below. And then we waited. That's mostly what fishing is, you know, waiting. But it's a good kind of waiting, not anxious or impatient, just present. Watching the bobber floating on the surface, watching for the telltale dip and duck that meant something was interested. Watching the water, the play of light on it, the insects skimming across the surface, watching the trees overhead, the leaves moving in the breeze, dappling the sunlight, listening to the creek, to the birds, to the rustling and chirping and humming of the woods in summer. Sometimes my grandfather would talk, sharing little bits of wisdom or observation. See that bird there? That's a kingfisher. See how he's watching the water? He's hunting same as us. Or, feel how cool it is here by the water. That's why the animals come here in the heat of the day. Smart creatures, animals, they know how to be comfortable. But mostly, we just sat in companionable silence, our lines in the water, our backs against the tree, at peace. We didn't catch much that day, a few small sunfish, bright and colorful, too small to keep, so we threw them back. One respectable bass that my grandfather caught fought for a minute, then landed with a whoop of satisfaction. That one we kept, stringing it on a line to keep it fresh in the creek water. Around midday, we took a break from fishing and ate the lunch my grandmother had packed. Sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, crisp and fresh, hard-boiled eggs, salted and peppered, cookies for dessert, oatmeal with raisins, chewy and sweet, an apple each, crunchy and tart. We ate sitting on those tree roots, our feet dangling over the water, and everything tasted better for being eaten outdoors in that beautiful place. After lunch, my grandfather stretched out in the shade, his hat over his face, and dozed. I waded into the creek, the water cold enough to make me gasp, but wonderful on such a hot day. It came up to my knees in the shallow parts, my thighs in the deeper spots. The bottom was rocky and slippery, and I had to move carefully, but it was worth it. I splashed and played, turned over rocks looking for crayfish, watched minnows dart away from my feet in silver flashes. When my grandfather woke, we fished a bit more, but our hearts weren't really in it. We'd had a perfect day, and we both knew it, and there was no need to push for more. So we packed up our gear, strung up our one fish, and headed back to the house. The walk back seemed shorter, or maybe I was just tired. The afternoon sun slanted through the trees at a different angle, golden and warm. We emerged from the woods into the bright open of the pasture, and the heat hit like a wall. Oh, but it was all right. We were almost home. My grandmother met us at the porch. "Catch anything?" she asked, and my grandfather held up the bass with pride. She admired it appropriately, then took it to clean while we washed up. That fish became our supper that night, fried crispy and served with hush puppies and coleslaw, and it tasted like the creek and the woods and the perfect lazy summer day, all in one. There were so many days like that on the farm, not exactly the same, but similar in their quiet goodness, days that built on each other, creating a childhood that was rich in the things that matter, time and attention and presence, connection to the land and the seasons and the natural world, the security of routine and the excitement of small adventures, the love of people who showed their love through actions more than words. I remember autumn on that farm and how different it was from summer. The air would turn crisp overnight, it seemed, going from warm and humid to cool and dry between 1 week and the next. The light would change too, getting more golden, more slanted, that particular autumn light that photographers love. The work of the farm would change with the season, less about growing and more about harvesting, about bringing in what had been planted and tended all summer, about preparing for winter. The garden would be at its peak in early fall, bursting with tomatoes and peppers and eggplants and squash. My grandmother would be in full preserving mode, and the kitchen would be hot and steamy with the work of it. She'd be canning tomatoes, making sauce and salsa, and whole tomatoes packed in jars. Or she'd be pickling cucumbers and peppers and whatever else could be pickled. She'd be making jam from the last of the berries, cooking it down until it was thick and sweet and jammy. I'd help her when I could, though I was more hindrance than help at that age. I'd wash vegetables carefully, making sure to get all the dirt off. I'd help pack jars, arranging tomatoes or pickles just so. I'd watch the canner, that big pressure cooker thing that sat on the stove and hissed and steamed and seemed slightly dangerous, and I'd call her if the gauge got too high or too low. And when the jars were done, when they'd been processed and cooled and sealed, we'd carry them down to the cellar, that cool, dim space under the house, with dirt walls and wooden shelves, where the temperature stayed constant year-round. We'd line up the jars on those shelves, each one labeled with what it was and when it was canned, and we'd step back and admire them. Rows and rows of jars, all full of colorful food, red tomatoes and green pickles and purple grape jelly and golden peaches. It was beautiful in its way, all that abundance, all that preparation. It was security, knowing that no matter what winter brought, we had food. It was accomplishment, seeing the literal fruits of our labor. It was satisfying in a deep, primal way. The fields would be harvested too, the corn cut and taken to the grain elevator, the soybeans combined and bagged. My grandfather would come in from a day of harvest work covered in dust and chaff, tired but satisfied. The granaries would be full, the work of the year almost done, and the leaves would change, putting on a show that never got old no matter how many times you saw it. The maples would turn red and orange, the oaks would turn brown and russet, the hickories would turn golden yellow. The whole woods would be ablaze with color, and on sunny days, with the light coming through those colored leaves, it was like standing inside a kaleidoscope. I'd rake leaves in the yard, big piles of them, and my grandfather would burn them in a barrel, and that smell of burning leaves is autumn to me even now, sweet and smoky and slightly melancholy, like the year itself was going up in smoke, making room for what came next. Halloween would come, and my grandmother would help me carve a pumpkin from the patch, a big orange one with a face that was more funny than scary. We'd put a candle in it and set it on the porch, and it would glow in the darkness like a friendly sentinel. Thanksgiving would come, and there would be family, aunts and uncles and cousins, all gathered around the big table that had been extended with extra leaves to fit everyone. Turkey and stuffing and all the fixins, pies of every kind, way too much food, but that was the point. And before we ate, we'd join hands around that table, and my grandfather would say grace. thanking God for the food and the family and the year's blessings, and his voice would be rough with emotion because he felt it, really felt it, that gratitude. And then winter would come, and the farm would slow down even more, would settle into a kind of hibernation. The fields would be bare, brown stubble showing through patches of snow. The garden would be dead, frost blackened and finished until spring. The trees would be bare, black branches stark against gray skies. But the farm would still be beautiful, in a different way. The snow would transform everything, covering the rough edges, making it all clean and new and quiet. So quiet. Snow absorbs sound. Did you know that? A snowy day is quieter than any other kind of day, muffled and peaceful. We'd stay inside more in winter, of course. The chores still had to be done. Animals still needed feeding and watering. Cows still needed milking. But they were done quicker, with less lingering because it was cold out there. Come inside with red cheeks and numb fingers and be grateful for the warmth of the house. My grandmother would be baking more because a hot oven helped heat the house, and because winter was the time for hearty food, bread and cookies and cakes and pies, roasts and stews and soups that simmered all day, filling the house with smells that made your mouth water, hot cocoa with marshmallows on top, warming your hands and your insides. The evenings would be long, dark, falling early, and we'd gather around a fireplace in the living room. My grandfather would build up the fire, adding logs until it roared and crackled, throwing out heat and light. We'd sit close to it, soaking in the warmth, watching the flames dance. My grandmother would knit or crochet, her needles clicking in the firelight. My grandfather would read the newspaper or a book, or sometimes he'd just sit and stare into the fire, his mind somewhere else, somewhere in the past or the future, or just in the mesmerizing dance of the flames. And I'd lie on the floor of my stomach, doing a puzzle or reading a book or just dreaming. And I'd feel the heat of the fire on my face and know that outside it was cold and dark, but in here it was warm and light and safe. Sometimes my grandfather would tell stories, and these were the best times. He'd tell about when he was a boy, about the farm as it used to be, about people long gone and times long past, about the blizzard of 1918 that buried the farm in snow for a week, about the drought in the 30s that cracked the earth and killed the crops and tested everyone's faith, about the war years when he was young and all the men went away and the women ran the farms, about meeting my grandmother at a church social, about how pretty she looked in her blue dress, about how he knew right then that she was the one, and my grandmother would blush and tell him to hush, but she'd be smiling, pleased that after all these years he still remembered, still felt that way. They'd tell about my father as a boy, about the trouble he'd get into and the clever things he'd do, about the time he climbed to the top of the barn and couldn't get down and my grandfather had to go up after him, about the time he brought home a stray dog and it turned out to be half wolf and they had to take it back to the woods, about the time he fell in the pond and came home covered in mud and algae, and my grandmother made him strip in the yard and hosed him down before she'd let him in the house. I loved these stories. They made my father real to me in a new way, made him a person instead of just Dad. They made my grandparents young again. gave them history and depth and lives beyond what I could see. They wove us all together, past and present, into a family story that was bigger than any one of us. Winter on the farm was a time of rest and reflection. The land was resting, gathering strength for spring, and we rested too, slowing down, turning inward, spending time with each other and our thoughts. I remember one winter night in particular. It had been snowing all day, big fat flakes that fell soft and thick, and by evening there must have been a foot of snow on the ground. Everything was white and pristine and beautiful. We'd had supper and cleaned up, and we were in the living room by the fire. My grandfather was in his chair, my grandmother in hers, me on the floor. The radio was on, playing music, old songs from before I was born, songs my grandparents knew and sometimes sang along to. And my grandmother set down her knitting and stood up, and she held out her hand to my grandfather. "Dance with me," she said, and he looked surprised, but he got up and he took her hand, and they danced there in the living room, slow and stately, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. Two old people in their slippers, dancing to an old song in a warm house while snow fell outside. I watched them, and I felt something I couldn't name. Love, certainly, but more than that. A sense of the endurance of things, of commitment and partnership, and choosing each other every day for a lifetime, of finding joy in simple moments, of staying young in the ways that mattered even as your body grew old. The song ended, and they pulled apart just a little, and my grandfather kissed my grandmother's forehead. "Thank you for the dance," he said, formal and sweet, and she smiled up at him, her face soft in the firelight. That moment is frozen in my memory like a photograph. The two of them standing there together with the fire behind them and the snow outside and the love between them almost visible, almost tangible. It's one of my most precious memories, a gift they gave me without knowing they were giving it. Spring would come again, the way it always does, no matter how long or hard the winter. One day you'd wake up and the air would smell different, feel different. The snow would be melting, running in rivulets down the driveway, dripping from the eaves. The ground would reappear muddy and brown, but ground nonetheless. And you'd hear birds, the ones that had come back from wherever they went, singing about territories and mates and the joy of being alive. And my grandfather would start getting restless, looking at seed catalogs, planting the garden, itching to get his hands in the dirt. And my grandmother would start her spring cleaning, washing windows and beating rugs and airing out the house. And the whole farm would come alive again, waking from its winter sleep, ready for another cycle of growth and work and harvest. The years I spent visiting that farm, they shaped me in ways I'm still discovering. They taught me about work and rest, about seasons and cycles, about the satisfaction of doing something well. They taught me about simplicity, about how little you really need to be content. They taught me about connection to the land and to family and to the past. My grandfather has been gone for many years now. My grandmother, too. The farm was sold after they passed, and I don't know what's become of it. I like to think someone's taken care of it, working that good land, living in that solid house. But I don't know, and in some ways, I don't want to know. I want to keep it the way it was in my memories, perfect and unchanging. But what they taught me, what they gave me, that's still here, still real, still guiding me in ways large and small. When I plant a garden, even just a few tomatoes in pots on my patio, I'm doing it the way my grandfather taught me. When I make jam, I use my grandmother's recipes, her methods. When I sit on my own porch in the evening and watch the stars come out, I'm continuing a ritual they started. They gave me a foundation, those summers on the farm, roots that go deep, that sustain me still, a sense of where I come from, of who my people were, of what matters, an appreciation for simple things, all for honest work, for the turning of the seasons. And they gave me peace, taught me how to be still, how to be present, how to find contentment in the moment I'm in, rather than always reaching for the next thing. That's what I hope to give to you, dear one, here in this quiet evening. That same peace, that same sense of being exactly where you need to be, exactly when you need to be there. That same feeling of being held and safe and loved. Let yourself feel it now, settling into your bones, into your breath, into your very being. Let the stories wash over you like a gentle stream, carrying away any worry, any tension, any thought that's keeping you from rest. The farm is still there in a way, in memory and in story. And you can visit it whenever you need to, whenever the world feels too loud or too fast or too harsh. Close your eyes, and you're there, walking through those fields, sitting under that oak tree, rocking on that porch. All of it waiting for you, peaceful and unchanging. My grandfather would sit at the end of a long day, and he'd let out this satisfied sigh, the sound of a man who'd done his work and done it well, who'd earned his rest and was ready to receive it. And I can hear that sigh now, feel it in my own chest, ready to release the day and welcome the night. Everything is all right, dear one. Everything is exactly as it should be. The work is done. The animals are fed and bedded down. The house is warm and safe. The people you love are near, even if you can't see them. You're held in something larger than yourself, something ancient and good. Let your eyes grow heavy now, if they haven't already. Let your breathing slow and deepen. Each breath in bringing peace, each breath out releasing whatever you don't need. Let your body sink into the softness beneath you, held and supported, completely at rest. The farm is quiet now in this moment. The sun has set. The animals are sleeping. The fields are dark and still, resting, gathering strength for tomorrow's growth. And you can rest too, deep and peaceful, knowing that morning will come when it's time, bringing its own gifts, its own work, its own small miracles. But that's tomorrow. Right now is just for this, just for resting, just for letting go, just for being held in the gentle darkness, safe and warm and completely at peace. Sleep now, dear one. Sleep in the peace of the farm, in the peace of memory, in the peace that passes understanding. Sleep knowing you're exactly where you need to be. The chickens are roosted in their coop, heads tucked under wings. The cows are lying in the barn, chewing their cud in the darkness, at peace. The cats are curled in the hay, warm and safe. Even the crickets have stopped their singing, settling into the deep quiet of night. And you can settle too, drifting down into sleep like a leaf drifting down to earth, gentle and natural and easy. No effort required, just allowing, just accepting, just sinking into the rest that's waiting for you. My grandfather's voice, if he were here, would be getting quieter now, softer, slower. The pauses between words getting longer, the words themselves getting fewer, until finally there were no more words, just presence, just the quiet breathing of someone at peace, just the soft darkness and the deeper quiet and the profound rest. And that's where you are now, in that place beyond words, that place of pure rest, that place of complete peace. Now let me tell you more about those days on the farm, dear one, about the rhythms and the seasons, about the lessons learned in doing simple work, about the kind of wisdom that comes not from books, but from living close to the land. Just settle in there even deeper now. Let your body relax completely and drift with me through more memories of that beautiful place, that beautiful time. You know, each season on the farm had its own character, its own work, its own gifts. I spent time there in every season over the years, and each one taught me something different, showed me another face of that land, that life. Summer, of course, was when I spent the most time there. School was out, days were long, and the farm was in full production mode. Everything growing, everything producing, work from dawn to dusk, but good work, satisfying work. I've told you about some of that already, but there was so much more to those summer days. The heat, for instance, real heat, the kind we don't get much anymore, or maybe I just don't notice it the same way. By mid-morning, the sun would be beaten down, and by afternoon, it was like walking into an oven when you stepped outside. The air would shimmer over the fields, and you could see heat waves rising from the metal roof of the barn. My grandfather had strategies for the heat. Work early, rest midday, work evening was his philosophy. We'd start at first light, get the most important tasks done while it was still relatively cool. Then, as the heat built, we'd slow down, take breaks more often, find shade when we could. And during the hottest part of the afternoon, we'd stop altogether, our retreat to the house, where my grandmother would have the curtains drawn against the sun, where the thick walls and high ceilings kept things relatively comfortable. Sometimes we'd sit on the porch during those hot afternoon hours in the shade, catching whatever breeze there was. My grandfather would tell stories, or we'd just sit in companionable silence, conserving energy, waiting for the day to cool enough to work again. The garden needed extra attention in the heat, watering, of course, but carefully. Water deep, but not often, my grandfather would say. You want the plants to send roots down deep, looking for water. You water light every day, the roots stay shallow, and the plant can't handle drought. Better to water thoroughly a couple times a week than a little bit every day. We'd water in the evening, after the sun had lost its strength. My grandfather had a system of furrows between the rows, and we'd open the gate on the irrigation ditch that ran from the creek, and water would flow through those furrows, soaking in, reaching the roots. I'd walk along with a hoe, making sure the water flowed evenly, breaking up any dams of soil, directing it where it needed to go. It was pleasant work, evening watering. The heat had broken, the air was cooling, and there was something deeply satisfying about guiding that water, seeing it soak into the thirsty soil, knowing it would reach the plants, keep them alive and growing. Life-giving work, literally. Harvest was constant in summer. Something was always ready to pick. We'd go out in the early morning with baskets and buckets, gathering whatever was ripe. Tomatoes, still cool from the night, heavy and perfect, some for eating fresh, some for canning. Beans, crisp and green, snapping satisfyingly when you broke them. Cucumbers, hiding under their big leaves, some small for pickling, some large for eating. Zucchini that seemed to grow overnight, suddenly enormous, prompting my grandmother to search for recipes that used lots of zucchini. Corn was a major harvest. When the corn was ready, and you could tell by the feel of the ears, by the silk turning brown, by years of experience, we'd spend days picking it, walking down the rows, feeling the ears, pulling the ones that were ready, tossing them into the wagon my grandfather pulled behind his tractor. Then came the processing, shucking the corn, sitting on the porch with a pile of ears, pulling off the husks and the silk, revealing the perfect rows of kernels underneath. Some corn went straight to the table, boiled and buttered. Some got cut off the cob and frozen. Some got canned as cream corn, a process that required cutting the kernels off and then scraping the cobs to get the milky juice, all of it mixing together into something sweet and delicious. My grandmother was a wizard at preservation. Nothing was wasted. Everything was used. Even the corn husks didn't go to waste. She'd save some for crafts. Others went to the compost or to the pigs. We live within our means, she'd say, working steadily at some task, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. We use what we have. We save what we can. We waste nothing. That's how you make it through the lean times, by being careful during the abundant times. The berries were another summer gift. There were blackberry brambles along the fence line at the back of the property, wild and thorny and productive. When they ripened, and you had to time it just right, pick them when they were fully ripe, but before the birds got them all. We'd go out with buckets, wearing long sleeves despite the heat to protect against the thorns, and we'd pick. Blackberry picking was hot, scratchy work. The thorns would catch your clothes, your skin, no matter how careful you were. The berries would stain your fingers purple. The sun would beat down, and the flies would buzz around, and you'd sweat and itch and wonder why you were doing this. But then you'd eat a berry, sun-warmed and sweet tart and perfect, and you'd remember why. And you'd think about the pies my grandmother would make, the jam, the berries frozen for cobblers in the winter. Oh, and it was worth it, worth every scratch, every drop of sweat. My grandmother made the most incredible blackberry pie. She'd make the crust from scratch, using lard and ice water and flour, her hands working the dough until it was just right. Not too much, not too little, just enough. She'd roll it out thin, line the pie plate, fill it with berries mixed with sugar and a little flour to thicken the juice, dot it with butter, cover it with a top crust with vents cut in it, and bake it until the crust was golden and the filling was bubbling through the vents. The smell of that pie baking would fill the house, make everyone stop what they were doing and drift toward the kitchen, drawn by that incredible aroma. And when it came out, when it had cooled just enough that you wouldn't burn your mouth completely, we'd have slices with fresh cream or ice cream, and it was heaven, pure, absolute heaven. The best things in life require work, my grandfather would say, savoring his pie. You want something good, you gotta earn it. Nothing worthwhile comes easy. Evenings in the summer were their own kind of magic. The work would wind down as the sun set. and we'd have that transition time between day and night, between work and rest. We'd sit on the porch, as I've told you, but there was more to it than I've said. Sometimes my grandfather would play music. He had a harmonica, small and silver, worn smooth from years of being carried in his pocket. He'd pull it out and play old songs, folk songs, hymns, melodies I didn't know, but that sounded right, sounded like they belonged to that place, that time. He wasn't a virtuoso, didn't play fancy or complicated, but he played with feeling, with soul, and the simple melodies floating out across the farmyard as the stars emerged felt perfect. Felt like the farm itself was being given a voice, singing its song. My grandmother would sometimes sing along, her voice soft and clear, remembering words to songs from her childhood, songs about love and loss and work and faith, songs that told stories, songs that had been passed down through generations. And I'd sit and listen, absorbing it all, this music that was part of the life, not separate from it, not performance, not entertainment, just expression, connection, a way of marking the end of the day. The fireflies would put on their own show, blinking on and off across the yard and the garden, out in the fields. I'd sometimes chase them. I'll catch them gently in my cupped hands, watch them crawl around glowing, then let them go again. Magic bugs, my grandmother called them, and they were. Natural magic, the kind you can hold in your hands. We'd watch storms come when they came, and on the farm you could see them coming from miles away. The sky would change, clouds building on the horizon, getting taller and darker and more ominous. The wind would pick up, shifting direction, getting cooler. The animals would know. The cows would head for the barn. The chickens would put themselves away. Even the birds would go quiet. My grandfather would watch the sky with a practiced eye. "We need the rain," he might say, or "Looks like this one might have hail. Better make sure everything's secured," or "This'll pass us by going north. We'll get the wind, but not the rain." He was usually right. Years of watching the sky, understanding weather patterns, reading the signs. Not perfect. Weather's too complicated for perfect predictions. But right, more often than not. When a storm did hit, it was spectacular. The wind would roar through, bending trees, sending leaves and debris flying. Lightning would crack and flash, sometimes so close you could smell the ozone, the thunder immediate and deafening. Rain would come in sheets, horizontal sometimes, pounding on the roof like drums, turning the farmyard into a temporary lake. We'd sit safe on the porch, covered, protected, and watch the show. The sheer power of it, the wildness, the reminder that nature was in charge, not us. Humbling and thrilling all at once. And after the storm passed, the world would be fresh and clean, the air cool and sweet, everything dripping, puddles everywhere reflecting the sky. The garden would look revived, the leaves bright green and perky. Steam would rise from the hot ground where the sun broke through the clouds. And often, if we were lucky, a rainbow would arc across the sky, brilliant against the dark clouds, a promise and a gift. "See that?" my grandfather would say, pointing at the rainbow. "That's nature's way of saying, we're good, everything's all right. Rain comes, storm passes, sun returns, and there's beauty as a reminder that hard times don't last forever." Summer nights on the farm were different from night anywhere else I'd known. So dark, first of all. No street lights, no neighbors' lights, no light pollution from a nearby city. Just the moon and stars. And on nights when the moon was new, the darkness was profound, almost tangible. But it wasn't frightening, that darkness. It was peaceful. You could see the Milky Way so clearly, that river of stars stretching across the sky. You could see satellites moving steadily across the dome of heaven, silent and distant. You could see meteors, shooting stars, brief streaks of light that made you gasp and make a wish. The sounds of night were soothing. Crickets and frogs, always owls calling back and forth. Sometimes a coyote would howl in the distance, and closer coyotes would answer, their voices rising and falling in that eerie song. It should have been scary, maybe, but it wasn't. It was just the nightlife of the farm, the nocturnal creatures doing their thing. My grandfather taught me not to fear the dark, not to fear the wild things. Oh, they're not interested in us, he'd say. They've got their own lives, their own concerns. We respect them, give them space, and they'll do the same for us. Fear comes from not understanding. Learn about something, understand it, and fear usually goes away. Sometimes we'd hear the cattle moving in the pasture, or a horse would whinny from the neighbor's place. Comforting sounds, domestic sounds, reminders that we weren't alone, that life surrounded us. Sleep in the summer came easy, despite the heat. My room would cool down as the night wore on, and with the window open, the fresh air flowing in, the distant sounds of the farm, I'd drift off without effort. Tired from the day's work, satisfied with what we'd accomplished, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow would be more of the same. Work and rest, effort and reward. The simple, a good cycle of farm life. But summer wasn't the only season I knew on that farm. I spent time there in other seasons too, and each had its own character, its own beauty, its own lessons. Autumn on the farm was a time of transition, of harvest winding down, of preparation for winter. The light changed, getting more golden, more slanted. The air got crisp, especially in the mornings and evenings, though the days could still be warm. The trees around the property would start to turn, putting on their show. The maples, brilliant red and orange, the oaks, deep brown and russet, the poplars, bright yellow. Against the blue autumn sky, it was a sight that caught your breath, made you stop whatever you were doing just to look. The garden was finishing up. The tomatoes were mostly done, the plants looking ratty and tired, but there were still tomatoes to pick, green ones that we'd bring inside to ripen on a windowsill, or that my grandmother would make into green tomato relish. The beans were done, the vines brown and dried, but the squash and pumpkins were at their peak, having grown all summer, now ready to harvest and store. We'd walk through the garden, my grandfather and I, assessing what was left, what needed picking, what could be pulled up and added to the compost. The summer squash and zucchini had finally succumbed to the powdery mildew that always got them eventually. The cucumber vines were brown and finished, but the winter squash, butternut and acorn and Hubbard, those were perfect, their hard shells protecting the sweet flesh inside. We'd cut them from the vines with a knife, leaving a bit of stem attached, and carry them to the porch, where they'd cure in the sun for a few days. Then they'd go to the root cellar, where they'd last for months, providing food well into winter. The pumpkins were treated the same way. Some were for eating. My grandmother would make pumpkin pie and pumpkin bread and pumpkin soup. Some were for jack-o'-lanterns for the grandchildren, for the tradition of it, and some were for the pigs, which loved them and would crunch into them with gusto, orange flesh and seeds flying everywhere. Corn harvest in autumn was different from the sweet corn of summer. This was field corn, dent corn, meant for animal feed and cornmeal. The ears were bigger, harder, the kernels not sweet but starchy. We pick it when the stalks were brown and the kernels were hard, then shuck it and store it in the corn crib, a slatted building that allowed air to circulate, keeping the corn dry. My grandfather would take some to the mill to be ground into cornmeal, and my grandmother would use that meal to make cornbread and corn muffins and johnny cakes, all of them delicious, with a texture and flavor you couldn't get from store-bought meal. Apples were an autumn gift. There were several apple trees at the edge of the property, old trees that had been there long before my grandparents bought the farm. They weren't cultivated varieties, nothing fancy, just old-fashioned apples. Some tart, some sweet, some good for eating fresh, some only good for cooking. We'd pick them, filling baskets and boxes. Some went to the neighbors. Some got made into applesauce, jars and jars of it, smooth and sweet and perfect. Some got made into apple butter, sauce which took all day to make, cooking down the apples with spices until they were dark and thick and spreadable. Some got made into pies and crisps and cakes, and some just got stored in the cellar in boxes with newspaper between the layers, where they'd keep for months if you checked them regularly and removed any that were starting to rot. My grandmother made the best apple pie. She'd peel and slice the apples. I'd help with this, using a paring knife carefully, trying to get the peel off in one long spiral like she could, and she'd mix them with sugar and cinnamon and a little nutmeg and lemon juice, then into a pie crust, dotted with butter, topped with another crust, vented and brushed with cream and sprinkled with sugar, baked until the crust was golden and the filling was bubbling, served warm with a slice of cheddar cheese on top, the way her mother had taught her, the way folks used to eat apple pie. It was transcendent, sweet and tart and spicy and buttery and cheesy all at once, complex and perfect. Fall work on the farm included a lot of putting things away, closing things down for the winter. The garden got cleared, all the dead plants pulled up and added to the compost pile. The soil got turned over, preparing it for the next year. A cover crop of winter rye would be planted to hold the soil and add nutrients, to be turned under in the spring. The animals needed different care in fall. The cows would be bred if they weren't already, so they'd calve in the spring. The pigs that were going to be butchered would be fed extra to fatten them up. The chickens would start to molt, looking ratty and half naked, but they'd grow new feathers and be ready for winter. We'd clean out the barn, removing the old bedding, adding fresh straw, making sure everything was tight and secure for the cold months ahead. Wood would be cut and split and stacked, cords and cords of it, enough to keep the stoves burning all winter. Storm windows would be put up, banking would be placed around the foundation of the house to keep out drafts. Hay bales would be stacked against the north side of the chicken coop for insulation. All of it preparation, making sure everything was ready, making sure they'd be comfortable and secure when the cold came. And the cold did come, sooner or later. Sometimes gradually, the temperatures dropping bit by bit over weeks. Sometimes suddenly, an early storm bringing snow and ice and a reminder that winter was always waiting. I was there for a few winters over the years, visiting for Christmas vacation or during a long weekend. Winter on the farm was quieter, slower, but beautiful in its own way. The work changed in winter. The garden was sleeping under snow or frozen ground. The fields were bare, but the animals still needed care. Feeding and watering twice a day, every day, no matter what the weather was doing. We'd bundle up in layers, long underwear and flannel shirts and sweaters and coats and hats and gloves and boots, and head out into the cold, breaking ice in the water troughs with an axe or a hammer, hauling hay to the animals, scattering grain for the chickens, making sure everyone had what they needed to get through another day. The cattle would be in the barn more in winter or in a sheltered area of the pasture. They'd grow thick winter coats, and they'd huddle together for warmth, their breath making clouds in the cold air. They'd watch us with patient eyes as we fed them, grateful in their bovine way for the hay and grain we brought. The chickens were tougher than you'd think. They'd hunker down in their coop, generating warmth with their bodies, their feathers fluffed up for insulation. They'd lay fewer eggs in winter. The short days and cold temperatures slowed their production, but they'd still lay some, and those winter eggs seemed extra precious, extra valuable. Inside work increased in winter. There was always firewood to bring in, to keep the stove fed, keep the house warm. The wood box by the stove needed filling several times a day, and splitting kindling was a constant task. My grandmother would be working on her winter projects. Quilting? Oh, often. She'd have a quilt frame set up in the living room, and she'd spend hours piecing together fabric scraps into patterns, creating beauty and warmth from what would otherwise be waste. Knitting, socks and mittens and hats and scarves, practical items that would be used or given as gifts. Mending, there was always mending to do. Clothes that needed patching, buttons that needed sewing, hems that needed fixing. And my grandfather would have his workshop projects. The workshop was a shed attached to the barn, with a wood stove for heat, a workbench, and tools hanging on every wall. He'd work on repairs there, fixing broken chairs, sharpening tools, building whatever was needed. A new gate for the pasture, a shelf for the pantry, a toy for a grandchild. I'd help him sometimes, learning how to use tools, how to measure and cut and join wood together, learning patience, precision, the satisfaction of making something with your hands. Measure twice, cut once, he'd say, showing me how to use the tape measure, the square, the level. Take your time, do it right, and you'll only have to do it once. Rush, cut corners, and you'll be doing it again, plus wasting material. Fast and sloppy is slower than slow and careful in the long run. Winter evenings were longer, darker, colder. We'd gather in the living room after supper, drawn to the warmth of the wood stove. My grandfather would feed it throughout the evening, adding logs, adjusting the damper, keeping the temperature comfortable. We'd read, often. My grandmother knitting, my grandfather with a farm magazine or the newspaper, and me with whatever book I'd brought or found on the shelves, old books, some of them, books my father had read as a boy, books that had been there for decades. Sometimes we'd play cards or board games, simple games, checkers or dominoes or rummy, playing not to win so much as to pass the time, to be together, to have something to do with our hands while we talked or sat in comfortable silence. My grandfather would sometimes read aloud, his deep voice filling the warm room, reading from the Bible or from some book of poetry or from the almanac, which he consulted regularly for planting dates and weather predictions and all sorts of practical information. The radio would be on sometimes, soft in the background. News and weather reports, farm reports with commodity prices and livestock updates, music programs playing old songs. The radio was their connection to the wider world, their source of information and entertainment before TV became common, and they listened to it with attention and appreciation. Winter nights, the house would get cold, despite the stove burning all evening. Heat doesn't distribute evenly in old farmhouses, and upstairs got especially cold. I'd climb into bed in that frigid room, my breath visible in the air, and I'd burrow under the quilts. My grandmother would pile on extra ones in winter, and I'd curl up tight, waiting for my body heat to warm the cocoon I'd created. It would take a while, that warming. The sheets would be icy at first, almost painful to touch. But gradually, warmth would build, trapped under those heavy quilts, and I'd unfurl a bit, get comfortable, feel the delicious contrast between the cold air on my face and the warmth under the covers. And I'd lie there listening to the sounds of winter night on the farm. The wind often howling around the corners of the house, rattling windows, making the whole structure creak and groan. Snow or sleet hitting the windows if a storm was happening. The occasional crack and pop of contracting wood as the temperature dropped. And from downstairs, the sounds of my grandparents getting ready for bed. The stove being banked for the night, damped down so it would burn slowly, still putting out heat through the dark hours. Water running as they washed up, their voices soft and indistinct, saying things I couldn't make out. Their footsteps on the stairs, the floor of their room, the squeak of their bed as they climbed into it. And then quiet, all deep quiet, the kind of quiet you only get in the country in winter. Snow muffles sound, cold air seems to as well, and with everything shut up tight, the silence is profound, peaceful, complete. Morning in winter came late, the sun not rising until well after we'd normally be up and working. We'd wake in darkness, the house cold, my grandfather already up and getting the stove going again, coaxing fire from the banked coals, adding kindling and then larger wood until heat started to build. By the time I got downstairs, the kitchen would be warming, my grandmother making breakfast, the windows fogged from the steam and heat, inside contrasting with the cold outside. Oatmeal often in winter, hot and thick and sweet, sticking to your ribs, giving you fuel to face the cold, or pancakes, or biscuits, gravy, or eggs and bacon. Always something substantial, something warming. And then out into the cold for morning chores, breath puffing, fingers getting numb even in gloves, moving quickly because moving generated heat, taking care of the animals who depended on us, who needed us every single day regardless of whether or how we felt. There was beauty in winter on the farm, though. Real beauty. The world simplified, reduced to essentials. White snow, dark trees, gray sky, or brilliant blue. Tracks in the snow telling stories, rabbit and deer and fox and bird, all of them leaving their signatures, their proof of passage. Icicles hanging from the barn eaves, long and thick and sparkling in the sun. Frost on windows, making intricate patterns like fern fronds or feathers. Snow loading the branches of evergreens until they bowed under the weight, and then releasing it all in a cascade when the sun or wind caught them right. The satisfaction of being warm when it was cold, of being fed when hunger bit, of being inside and safe when the storm raged. The coziness of it, the hunkering down, the simplification of life to basics. Stay warm, stay fed, stay safe, take care of what needs taken care of. And through it all, my grandparents steady and calm, never panicking, never complaining. Just doing what needed doing day after day, the rhythm unbroken by weather or season or circumstance. Spring on the farm was rebirth, renewal, hope. The snow would melt, reluctantly at first, then faster as the days lengthened and the sun strengthened. Mud everywhere, unbelievable mud. The ground saturated, everything wet and messy and alive. The birds would return, wave after wave of them. Robins first, harbingers of spring, their cheerful song announcing that winter was truly over. Then bluebirds and swallows and all the others, filling the trees with sound and movement and color. The garden would be prepared, the soil turned over, last year's rye crop turned under, compost added, everything made ready for planting. My grandfather would walk the garden, taking handfuls of soil, feeling it, assessing its readiness. Too wet to work, the soil would clump and pack and be ruined. Too dry, it wouldn't turn properly, just right. And he knew just right by feel, by experience, just right, and it would be time. Planting was a ritual, a prayer, an act of faith. You put seeds in the ground, not knowing what the weather would bring, what challenges would arise, what the harvest would be. You did it on faith, on hope, on the knowledge that this is what you do, what people have done for thousands of years, the fundamental act of agriculture, of civilization. My grandfather would plant with precision and care, rows straight as a string line, seeds at the proper depth, proper spacing. Give them the best start you can, he'd say. Then it's up to them and the weather and the Lord. You've done your part. And within days, miraculously, green shoots would appear, the seeds germinating, breaking through the soil, reaching for the light. Every year it happened. Every year it was miraculous. Life from seeming death, growth from dormancy, the eternal cycle beginning again. Baby animals in spring, calves and chicks, and sometimes kittens from the barn cats. New life everywhere, wobbly and vulnerable and absolutely precious. I'd spend hours watching them, amazed by their innocence, their energy, their rapid growth. Spring was hope embodied, the world waking up, shaking off winter, stretching toward summer, flowers blooming, daffodils first, then tulips, then a progression of blooms through the season. Trees budding, that particular green of new leaves so bright and tender it almost glowed. Grass greening, growing fast, needing to be mowed. Work increased in spring, everything that had been dormant now demanding attention. But it was good work, welcome after the confinement of winter, done with energy and enthusiasm and hope. And through all the seasons, through all the work and the rest, the struggle and the satisfaction, My grandparents steady and sure, teaching without preaching, showing by example, loving without condition. They taught me about work, real work, the kind that matters. Not work for work's sake, not busy work, but purposeful effort that produced something tangible, something valuable. Food to eat, clothes to wear, a warm place to live. The direct connection between effort and result, between labor and reward. They taught me about patience, about things taking time, about not being able to rush natural processes, about working steadily toward goals that might be months away, about trusting the process even when you couldn't see results yet. They taught me about resilience, about whether you can't control crops that fail despite your best efforts, animals that die, plans that don't work out, and about getting up the next day and trying again, because that's what you do. You don't quit, you don't give up, you adapt and persist and keep going. They taught me about stewardship, about taking care of things, about leaving things better than you found them, about thinking of future generations. The land wasn't just theirs to use, it was theirs to care for, to nurture, to pass on. They taught me about community, about neighbors helping neighbors, about sharing abundance, about being there for each other in hard times, about the web of relationships that made life possible and good. They taught me about simple pleasures, about satisfaction in a good meal, comfort in a warm fire, joy in a job well done, about not needing much to be happy, about finding contentment in what you have rather than always wanting more. They taught me about love, though they rarely used a word. Love shown through actions, the food always ready, the home always welcoming, the teaching always patient. Love woven into every day, every interaction, every moment together. Now, let me tell you about the deeper things I learned on that farm, dear one. About the lessons that went beyond seasons and chores. About the wisdom my grandparents shared, not through lectures, but through living. About the gifts they gave me that I'm still unwrapping all these years later. Just let yourself sink even deeper now, completely relaxed, completely at peace, and drift with me through these final memories, these lasting treasures. You know, looking back now from the distance of all these years, I realize that my grandparents were teaching me a whole philosophy of life there on that farm. Not in any formal way. They weren't educated people in the conventional sense, hadn't been to college, didn't read philosophy books, but they knew things, deep things, true things, things that matter. They taught me about time and how to spend it. In our modern world, we're always in a hurry, always rushing, always trying to do more, fit more in, be more productive. But on the farm, time moved differently. Not slower exactly, but more deliberately, more intentionally. My grandfather never rushed, never. I watched him for hours and hours over the years, watched him work, and he always moved at the same steady pace. Not slow, he got a tremendous amount done, but not frantic either, just steady, deliberate, present with what he was doing. If you rush, he told me once, you make mistakes, and mistakes cost time to fix. So rushing actually makes you slower. Better to move at a pace you can sustain, do things right the first time, and you'll get there faster in the end. He was talking about repairing a fence, but he could have been talking about anything. Life, maybe. And he lived it. Everything he did with complete attention. When he was milking a cow, he was milking a cow. not thinking about 10 other things, not worrying about what came next, just there with that cow, that task, that moment. When he was eating supper, he was eating supper, tasting the food, appreciating it, being present at the table. My grandmother was the same way. When she was kneading bread, she was kneading bread. When she was weeding the garden, she was weeding the garden. Whatever she was doing, that's what she was doing. Full attention, full presence. It sounds simple, maybe even obvious. But it's not. Not really. How many of us actually live that way? How many of us are truly present with what we're doing, rather than always thinking ahead to the next thing, or back to the last thing? Or worried about something else entirely. They taught me about that presence, that attention, that being here now. Not through words so much as through example, through the way they moved through the world, through the quality of their attention. And it made everything richer. Food tasted better when you really tasted it. Work was more satisfying when you were fully present with it. Rest was more restorative when you weren't using it to worry about tomorrow. They taught me about enough, about having enough, being enough, doing enough. In a culture that's always pushing for more money, more success, more possessions, more everything, they showed me a different way. They had a small farm, nothing fancy, nothing grand. They weren't wealthy by any standard measure, but they had enough food, grown by their own hands, enough clothes worn but mended, functional, enough shelter, a house that kept them warm and dry, enough work to keep them busy but not overwhelmed, enough rest to keep them healthy, enough love to fill their hearts and overflow to others. Don't need much to be happy, my grandmother would say, surveying her simple kitchen, her modest home. Need food and shelter and work you can be proud of. Need people to love and people who love you. Need to feel useful, needed. The rest is just extra, nice if you have it, but not necessary. She wasn't being pious or fake humble. She genuinely believed it, genuinely lived it. And I saw that it was true. They were happy, my grandparents. Deeply, genuinely happy in a way that a lot of wealthy, successful people aren't. They taught me that happiness isn't about having everything you want. It's about wanting what you have, about appreciating it, about finding satisfaction and joy in simple things. A good meal shared with people you love. A day's work done well. A warm bed when you're tired. The changing seasons. A garden growing. Animals healthy and productive. These things made them happy. Truly, deeply happy. And their happiness wasn't dependent on circumstances beyond their control. They'd had hard years. Years when crops failed, when money was tight, when things broke and couldn't be easily fixed. But they'd gotten through it together, and they'd been happy even in the hard times. Not happy that things were hard, but happy in spite of it. Happy because they had each other, had their work, had their values, and their faith, and their sense of purpose. Can't control the weather, my grandfather would say. Looking at a field damaged by hail or drought. Can't control the markets. Can't control a lot of things. But you can control how you respond. Can control your attitude, your effort, your character. That's where you put your energy, on what you can control, not what you can't. Wisdom, real wisdom, though he'd probably never call it that. They taught me about community, about being part of something larger than yourself. The farm wasn't isolated, wasn't self-sufficient in the way you might imagine. They were part of a network of neighbors and friends and family all helping each other, all connected. When someone had a barn raising or needed help with harvest, people showed up, just showed up, with their tools and their strong backs and their willing hands. They worked together all day, and then they'd share a meal together. And then they'd go home, knowing that when they needed help, it would be there. My grandfather helped neighbors fix equipment, shared his tools, lent his time and expertise freely. My grandmother shared her abundance. When the garden was producing more than they could use, she'd take vegetables to neighbors. When she baked extra, she'd bring pie or bread to someone who was sick or elderly or just in need of a kind gesture. And when they needed help, it came. When my grandfather hurt his back one year and couldn't do heavy lifting for a while, neighbors came and did his chores. When my grandmother was sick, neighbor women brought food, did laundry, made sure my grandfather was fed and the house was kept up. Nobody kept score. Nobody expected direct reciprocity. You helped because you could, because that's what community meant. Because you knew you were all in this together. We need each other, my grandmother would say. Nobody makes it alone. The ones who think they can, the ones who try to, they're missing out on something important. We're meant to help each other, meant to be connected. In our modern world, we've lost a lot of that. We live in our individual homes with our privacy fences and our garage door openers, and we barely know our neighbors. We hire professionals to do things we used to do for each other. We've gained independence, but lost interdependence. And I think we're poorer for it. They taught me about integrity, about doing the right thing even when no one's watching, even when it costs you something. My grandfather's word was his bond. If he said he'd do something, he did it. Period. No excuses, no backing out, no compromising. Your reputation is all you really have, he'd say. Money comes and goes, possessions wear out, but your reputation, that's built over a lifetime, and it can be destroyed in a moment. You guard it by being someone people can trust, someone who does what they say they'll do. And he lived it. I never once saw him cut a corner, cheat, or compromise his standards. Not once. Even when it would have been easy, when no one would have known, when it would have benefited him to do so. Once he sold a calf to a neighbor, and after the neighbor had taken it home, my grandfather realized he'd undercharged, had miscalculated the weight or the price per pound, something. It was his mistake, and the neighbor didn't know about it. But my grandfather drove over and explained the error and asked for the difference. The neighbor was surprised. I tried to say it was fine, not to worry about it, but my grandfather insisted. A deal's supposed to be fair to both parties, he said. This wasn't fair to me, and that makes it not right. I'd rather lose money than lose my integrity. Little thing, maybe, but it showed who he was, what he valued, and the neighbor told that story to other people, and it added to my grandfather's reputation as someone you could trust absolutely. My grandmother was the same way, honest in all her dealings, fair, kind, but not a pushover. She'd speak her mind when something wasn't right, but she'd do it with grace and clarity, not with meanness or judgment. They taught me that how you do anything is how you do everything. That character isn't something you put on and take off depending on the situation. It's who you are all the time, in all circumstances. They taught me about faith, though they weren't preachy about it. They believed in God, went to church regularly, prayed before meals and at bedtime. But their faith was practical, grounded, integrated into their daily lives rather than separate from it. God gave us this land to steward, my grandfather would say. Gave us minds to think with, hands to work with, the ability to grow food and raise animals. Our job is to do our best with what we've been given and trust that He'll provide what we need. It wasn't passive faith, wasn't sitting around waiting for miracles. It was active faith, doing the work and trusting the outcome, planting seeds and trusting they'd grow, caring for animals and trusting they'd be healthy, working hard and trusting it would be enough. And when things went wrong, as they sometimes did, they accepted it with a kind of grace that was remarkable. Not for us to understand everything, my grandmother would say. Sometimes bad things happen. Sometimes we don't know why. But we trust that there's a bigger picture, a longer timeline than we can see. It gave them peace, that faith. Not the kind of peace that means nothing bad ever happens, but the kind that means you can endure whatever comes because you're not facing it alone, not holding it all yourself. They taught me about simplicity, about living with less. Not because they had to. They could have afforded more, could have upgraded, modernized, accumulated, but they chose not to. Chose simplicity deliberately. More stuff just means more to take care of, my grandfather would say. More to maintain, more to worry about, more to clutter up your life. Better to have less and really appreciate what you have. Their house was neat, but not fancy. Furniture that was old but well cared for, functional, comfortable. No decorations just for decoration's sake. Everything served a purpose, had a function, and everything was maintained, repaired when needed, kept in good working order. Use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without, my grandmother would recite like a mantra. That's how we were raised, and it served us well. She darned socks until there was more darning than original sock. She'd patch clothes until they couldn't be patched anymore. She'd save string and rubber bands and jars and anything else that might be useful. Not out of poverty. They weren't poor, but out of a philosophy of not wasting, of using things fully before discarding them. In our throwaway culture, this seems almost quaint, but there was wisdom in it. Environmental wisdom, yes, using less, wasting less, being gentler on the earth. But also psychological wisdom, not being enslaved to stuff, to acquisition, to the constant churn of buying and discarding and buying again. They had what they needed, they maintained it well, and they were content, free, in a way that people buried under possessions and debt are not. They taught me about the seasons of life, about accepting change, about the cycles we all go through. They were old when I knew them, past their prime in physical terms. But they didn't fight it, didn't try to pretend they were younger than they were. Everything has its season, my grandfather would say, echoing the biblical passage. A time to be young and strong, a time to be old and wise, a time to work hard with your body, a time to work with your mind and your experience. You don't fight the seasons, you move with them. They had been young once, had worked harder, done more physical labor, but they'd adjusted as they aged, worked smarter rather than harder, let younger neighbors help with the heaviest tasks, accepted the limitations that came with age without bitterness or resentment. And they'd gained things with age, too. Perspective, wisdom, a long view that comes from having lived through many cycles, many seasons. Patience that comes from knowing that hard times pass and good times come again. Confidence that comes from having survived challenges and come out the other side. Young people think they know everything, my grandmother would say with a gentle smile. And in a way they do. They know what it's like to be young, which we've forgotten. But they don't know what it's like to be old yet. That's not a criticism, just a fact. You can't know until you get here. And she'd share what she'd learned gently, without forcing it, about what matters and what doesn't, about what lasts and what's temporary, about what's worth fighting for and what's better to let go. They taught me about love, though they'd have been embarrassed to call it that. They weren't demonstrative people, didn't go around saying, "I love you" all the time, didn't make grand romantic gestures. But they loved deeply. You could see it in everything they did. Oh, the way my grandfather would make sure my grandmother's coffee was exactly how she liked it every morning. The way my grandmother would make his favorite foods without being asked. The way they worked together, each knowing their role, supporting each other, functioning as a team. The way they'd sit together in the evening, not needing to talk, just content to be in each other's presence. The way they'd share a look across the room when something amused them both. The way my grandfather's face would soften when he looked at my grandmother, and hers would do the same when she looked at him. 60 years they'd been married by then. 60 years of working together, raising children together, facing whatever life brought together. And they were still partners, still friends, still clearly devoted to each other. Marriage is work, my grandmother told me once. Don't let anybody tell you different. It's work to stay connected, to keep communicating, to forgive the little irritations and disappointments. But it's good work, important work. And when you find the right person and you both commit to doing that work, well, there's nothing better. My grandfather would probably have blushed if he'd heard her being so sentimental. But he'd have agreed with every word. They taught me about death, too, about accepting it as part of life. Not the enemy, but the inevitable conclusion, the final season. They weren't morbid about it, didn't dwell on it. But they weren't afraid of it either. They lost people, parents, siblings, friends, neighbors. They'd seen death up close on the farm and in their lives, and they'd made their peace with it. When it's my time, my grandfather would say with a shrug. I've lived a good life, done good work, loved good people. When the Lord calls me home, I'll be ready. And he was. He died peacefully in his sleep, in his own bed, on his own farm, with my grandmother beside him. Just slipped away one night. His work done, his time complete. He was 87. My grandmother lasted another 3 years after he died. She stayed on the farm as long as she could, with help from neighbors and family. But eventually it became clear she couldn't manage alone, and she moved to town, to a small apartment near my parents. She never complained about it, but you could tell she missed the farm, missed the work, the animals, the garden, the rhythms she'd known for over 60 years. Missed my grandfather most of all. Lost the partner she'd built a life with. Half of me is missing, she told me once simply, factually, not looking for sympathy, but just stating truth. We were together so long we were like one person. Now he's gone and I'm still here, and it feels strange. But it won't be long now. I'll see him again soon. She was 91 when she died. Heart just gave out one day, quietly, peacefully. She'd been sitting in her chair, knitting, and she just stopped, put down her needles, closed her eyes, and left. The farm was sold. None of the children wanted to take it on. They had their own lives, their own careers, lived too far away. It went to a young couple, I heard. People who wanted to try farming, wanted that life. I hope they've been good stewards. I hope they've loved it like my grandparents did. I've never gone back. As part of me wants to see it again, walk those fields, stand in that barn, remember. But part of me is afraid to, afraid it'll have changed too much, afraid I won't recognize it, afraid it'll ruin my memories. Better, maybe, to keep it perfect in my mind, the way it was, the way it always will be in memory. The white farmhouse with its wide porch, the red barn leaning slightly, the garden rows stretching out, the pasture with its grazing cows, the creek running clear and cold, and my grandparents, always my grandparents, working and laughing and loving and living that good, simple life. They've been gone for decades now, most of my life, really. But they're not gone, not really. They live on in me, in what they taught me, in how they shaped me, in the way I approach work and rest and relationships and challenges, in the values I hold, the priorities I set, the person I try to be. I never became a farmer, took a different path, lived in cities, had a different kind of life. But I carried the farm with me, carried the lessons, the wisdom, the love, and I passed it on as best I could to my own children and now to my grandchildren. Tell them stories about the farm, about my grandparents, about the life they lived. Take them to farmers' markets, show them gardens, teach them where food comes from. Try to give them some sense of connection to the land, to seasons, to real work and real food and real life. It's harder now. The world is so different. Screens and speed and constant stimulation. Everything instant, everything available, nothing requiring patience or effort or waiting. But the old truths are still true. The old wisdom is still wise. And people still need what that farm gave me. Connection, purpose, simplicity, presence, community, love. So I share what I can through stories like this one, through example as much as my limited example can demonstrate, through trying to live by the values my grandparents showed me, even in a world very different from theirs. And I genuinely hope, that somewhere in this sharing, something takes root. Some seed of that farm wisdom finds purchase in fertile soil and grows into something good, something that connects this generation to that one, that carries forward the best of what was, adapted for what is. Because we need it, I think. Need that grounding, that wisdom, that connection to land and seasons and real work and simple pleasures. Need to slow down, be present, appreciate what we have. Need to work with our hands and our hearts, not just our heads. Need to be part of communities, helping and being helped. Need to live with integrity, with faith, with purpose. The farm taught me all that and more. My grandparents gave me gifts beyond measure, and now, in the evening of my own life, I try to pass those gifts along, try to be to others what they were to me, patient, present, loving, wise in the simple, practical ways that matter. And when my time comes, and it will come, sooner rather than later at my age, I want to go like they did, peacefully, with my work done, having lived well, loved well, given what I could to those who came after. I want to be able to look back and say, like my grandfather could have said, it's been a good life. I've done good work. I've loved good people. And I'm ready for whatever comes next. That's the final gift they gave me, maybe. Not fear of death, but acceptance of it. Not grasping desperately to stay, but being willing to let go when it's time. Trusting that life has been good and death is just the next season, the final harvest, the long rest after the long work. And in that acceptance, that trust, there's peace, deep peace, the kind of peace that passes understanding, that holds you through everything, that makes all of it, the work and the rest, the joy and the sorrow, the living and the dying, all of it all right. So rest now, dear one. Rest in that peace. Let the farm and my grandparents and all these memories wrap around you like a warm quilt on a cold night. Let them comfort you, settle you, carry you into deep and peaceful sleep. The farm is always there, in memory, in story, in the lessons that endure. The work has been done. The seasons have turned. The cycle is complete, and you can rest fully and completely, knowing that you're part of that long story, that great cycle, that endless turning of seasons and generations and love passing from hand to hand, heart to heart. You're held in that love now, just as I was held in my grandparents' love, just as they were held in the love of those who came before them, held and safe and completely, perfectly all right. The garden sleeps under its blanket of mulch or snow. The barn stands solid and patient. The house lights glow warm in the evening darkness. And inside, around the table, generations gather. Those who've passed on and those still here and those yet to come, all connected, all part of the same story, the same love, the same eternal cycle. Yes, sleep now, dear one. Sleep deeply and peacefully. Let all worry go. Let all tension release. Let everything that isn't peace just fall away. You're on the farm now, in the safe place, the good place, the place where love lives and work has meaning and seasons turn as they should. The crickets are singing their evening song. The stars are emerging one by one. The cool night air carries the scent of earth and growing things, and somewhere a screen door closes with that familiar creak and slap, and footsteps cross the porch, and a gentle voice calls softly, "Time to come in now, time for rest." And you go willingly, gratefully, into that warm kitchen, that safe house, that perfect place of rest. The day is done, the work is finished, and sleep awaits. Deep and restorative and full of dreams of gardens growing and seasons turning and love that never ends.